to argue you've delivered based on a forecast is crazy. In the same way, if I was managing your money and I said to you, I'm forecast to generate a return of 50%, pay me my commission now, what would you say? Like, you'd be like, what are you talking about? Like, piss off. Okay, so it's that time. The budget has been announced. I think it's been one of the most anticipated budgets we've seen in quite some time. And it's the gift that keeps giving, essentially. So let's dive into this and see what the Chancellor has to say.
Of their constituents. As Chairman of Ways and Means, I have responsibility to oversee the House's consideration of the budget statement and the ensuing resolutions, which are described in Erskine May paragraph 36-33 as the most important business of Ways and Means in this House. I want honourable members on all sides of the House to have adequate opportunity to hold the Chancellor to account, rather than hear and read about new policies on a daily basis in the media. And like many, I also expected better. Before I call the Chancellor of the Exchequer, I remind honourable members that copies of the budget resolutions will be available to them from the vote office in members' lobby at the end of the Chancellor's statement and online. Shh. I also remind honourable members that interventions are not taken during the Chancellor's statement, nor during replies to the Leader of the Opposition or the Leader of the Liberal Democrats. I call the Chancellor of the Exchequer. Yeah.
Okay, so what the Speaker of the House, I think that's the job title of that lady, was outlining there was a leak regarding the OBR forecast, which is against convention. Normally that comes out after the budget has been announced. So it's quite a serious issue. And there's obviously been a lot of finger pointing around what has happened with that regard. And basically, essentially, it's undermining Labour's authority. And that's something basically the opposition has been talking about. So it's a pretty serious issue, actually, and I'm not sure how it's happened. It's something that's being investigated. The other thing she was outlining as well is that essentially this is just part of a process in which the opposition and others that are present in the House of Commons have an opportunity to hold the Chancellor to account. And this is essentially what you would expect of an opposition. And this is something I've talked about quite a lot in a lot of other content I've made. Just because you're not in power, just because you're not the ruling party, it doesn't mean you get to take a break, and it doesn't mean you get to abscond from your responsibilities to challenge the ruling government, essentially. And that is the job of an effective opposition party. So that is essentially what she was outlining there before introducing the Chancellor. So she essentially doesn't want anyone to interrupt her, because there'll be an opportunity. That main and first opportunity will be the Leader of the Opposition, which is Kemi Badenoch, who is sitting opposite from the Chancellor. And then others thereafter will get a chance to have their say, essentially. I mean, it's ridiculous how noisy that is. It really is a circus.
Chancellor.
Madam Deputy Speaker, it is my understanding that the Office of Budget Responsibility's Economic and Financial Outlook was released on their website before this statement. This is deeply disappointing and a serious error on their part. The Office for Budget Responsibility have already made a statement taking full responsibility for their breach.
So that's why the Chancellor is at pains there to state that this is an OBR breach, because she knows it reflects badly on Labour. Whether it's Labour's fault or not, I don't actually know. I don't really know that much about that process. But the fact that she's emphasising it's OBR's mistake would suggest to me that there is an implicit understanding that it looks badly for Rachel Reeves and the party by extension.
Madam Deputy Speaker, we are rebuilding our economy. Over the last 16 months, we have overhauled our planning system to get Britain building, forged new trade deals with the United States, India and the European Union, reformed our visa system to bring the brightest and the best to Britain. We changed our fiscal rules that we inherited from the Conservatives and raised public investment to its highest level in 4 decades.
Okay, so just to give a bit of context here around a lot of the things she's said, essentially what she's doing is she's framing the economy as Labour sees it, right? So in my last video where I covered my reaction or the response Nigel Farage gave to Rachel Reeves's pre-budget speech, I talked a lot about ideology and beliefs and philosophy of relevant, the respective party, i.e. Reform in that case. So with Labour, when she said she rebuilt the economy and she's fixed things, as she put it, and she's done trade deals, and she's basically applied fiscal rules, she's talking about a vision of the economy which prioritizes spend. And again, it's something I talked about in the Reform video I covered. So it's shifting it from the structure that the Conservatives had, which prioritized reducing the amount of public spending, whilst Labour is a party that believes in investing in the state, in public services, which she talked about. NHS, is the main example she'll give, as well as defence. So that is the context in which I would interpret this framework and this setting she's outlining here with respect to reshaping and fixing the economy.
And in last year's budget, I raised taxes on business and the wealthiest to close the £22 billion black hole in the public finances left by the party opposites.
Okay, so when she talks about the wealthiest, and this is one of the frustrations I have, the wealthiest typically tends to be high earners. These are people that receive a salary. This may even be business owners as well, but these will be maybe small businesses, SMEs. So these are small to medium enterprises, and business owners of those types of businesses. So these are not listed companies, right? For example. And these individuals can be described as doing really well. We can describe these individuals as being successful. And when you look at the breakdown of tax intake for the government, and you see income tax and PAYE, and you will see, okay, most of that is coming from, those that earn the most. These are people that are earning through a salary, essentially. And basically, regardless of their level of income, broadly speaking, they are going to be living month to month like every other person that works. So when she talks about taxing the wealthiest, that's typically who they're talking about. Now, I personally don't define someone in that scenario, regardless of their level of income, as wealthy, because if the majority of your wealth is being built through offering your services for a salary, then to me, you are far poorer than somebody that can leverage their assets and generate wealth that way, and then pay themselves, say, $1, as we see in the US, for example. So for me, if you're going to say you're taxing the wealthiest, then to me, it's hard to not talk about a wealth tax, is essentially what I'm saying. And that's not what Labour has done. So I don't really buy into this argument that they've raised taxes on the wealthiest.
From opponents to planning reform, who will always demand that the future is built somewhere else, not in their backyard. Opponents to trade, who want to take us down the path of isolation and division.
Okay, so when she talks about isolation and division and opponents to trade, I kind of think she's talking about reform here, where, and one of the things I talked about, and the reason I say this is one of the things I talked about in Nigel Farage's reaction to the pre-budget speech was this idea that we needed to deregulate, and we squandered Brexit. So if you're taking the view that you're going to have a regulatory environment that differs from your main trading partner, it could be reframed as being someone that has an isolated view, in terms of how they look at the economy, essentially. So that is why I think when she says that, it's kind of like an indirect shot at reform. And again, it's just a reflection of their different ideology around things more than anything else.
Opponents to investment, who believe that the only good thing a government can do is get out of the way.
And again, that's another reform shot, I would say. I mean, the Conservatives have that kind of ideology as well, where they would say, okay, we should have a smaller state with smaller spending. But Nigel Farage has been very clear about the fact that he doesn't view government as very competent, i.e. politicians, because they don't have the necessary prerequisite skills, i.e. they don't have business experience. Again, I have my own view about the relevance of business experience, but that is Nigel Farage's view. And therefore, his view is that because the government isn't competent, it's in the best interests of the country that qualified business experts, are allowed to do what they do best, is basically the simplistic argument here. So again, that is why I think she's directly challenging and taking shots at reform. But what it also does tell you is the increasing influence of reform, actually, more than anything else. Why does she actually feel the need to say anything that I may, for example, interpret as something that is aimed at not the person sitting opposite her, but actually somebody sitting somewhere else at the back benches, who is stealing a march on the next election potentially, in terms of memberships and in terms of just the sentiment around, where the motion is in terms of politically. So again, it is quite interesting how even in that things are shifting in terms of politics and what people think, and what they're looking for, I suppose, in terms of government.
Opponents who insist that the only way to balance the books is to cut public spending.
And that would be a Conservatives / reform criticism, essentially. So it would be reform and the Tories that would argue for cuts. I mean, the Conservatives have been arguing for the cuts the most. Nigel Farage also said that she wasn't brave enough with respect to cuts. And again, the reason for that, is their ideology. So their view would be, as I mentioned, you would have a smaller state. Certainly you'd have less benefits, less generous benefits, because they would view them as generous. And therefore encourage people to be productive, to work. And that is why Nigel Farage often talks about production per capita, for example. And the other argument as well is that it's simply not affordable, right? So, and again, I would slightly agree with this, but for different reasons, right? The reason I would say it's becoming less affordable and arguably unaffordable is because of the reliance on income tax. If you consider other taxes, then there is the possibility to keep maintaining this level of investment and public expenditure that the Labour government wants to commit to. But if you're not prepared to do that, then it becomes less affordable. And that's essentially the problem that the Chancellor is having now with respect to the level of borrowing in order to keep this going, right? So that is why, I think it's a fair challenge, actually, that the Conservatives and the Reform Party are making. And to some degree, it's reflective of the sentiment, anecdotally, that I'm sensing when people I talk to, in terms of the algorithmic bubble, what I'm seeing on the media, for example. And I always take the view that actually spend should always be challenged as a matter of principle, regardless of whether you're socialist leaning, an isolationist, as the Chancellor put it, or capitalist leaning, right? You've got to make sure that every pound is being used effectively, is being used efficiently. And therefore, that is why in that context, I think, although she's rebutting that argument about the fact that people are looking for cuts, my own view is that it's a fair challenge, especially when you consider the fact, in her own admission, the country is struggling to pay back the debt, even the interest, right? They're struggling to even just pay the interest, not the principal. So I think right now, her ideology is not too strong here without finding a better way of funding it, and a better and fairer way, in my view, of generating more tax receipts.
And opponents who say that we don't need to balance the books at all.
Nobody is saying that, right? And I don't think she can make that argument. So Labour would not say we don't need to balance the books. The Conservatives certainly would not say we do not need to balance the books. And Reform have never said we don't need to balance the books. If anything, the Conservatives and the Reform Party in particular are more aggressive about that position right? They're even less pragmatic around the fact you need to balance the books. The way they balance the books is what is the argument, right? It's how you get there. Do you invest more with the aim that you grow GDP more, and therefore that's how you balance the books? Or do you take a more prudent approach and say, actually, let's just cut down expenditure? It may result in less GDP growth, but it's a more prudent, safer approach, which may give opportunities to reduce the tax burden, right? So ultimately, everyone's trying to play the same game economically. It's just how you get there.
But we made these choices for a reason. Because after 14 years of Conservative government, working people demanded and deserved change. Investments, not cuts to our public services. Stability for our public finances. The single most important factor in getting the cost of living down.
Yeah, and I think I wouldn't totally disagree with her here. There was an element of just protest voting because people were so dissatisfied with the Conservatives, which is why Labour won. And again, it was the reason why the Conservatives came into power in the first place, actually, because people were so dissatisfied with Labour at the time. But I think for me, when she says that people don't want to see austerity, I would agree. People don't want to see austerity. So austerity is basically when you really scale back spending, and it tends to have a detrimental impact on economic growth. But I think ultimately it depends. Again, is what you're trying to do affordable, and that's the bit she's not really addressing, because whether it is affordable or not, like, she will convince us it's affordable because of her fiscal rules. But I think there is a doubt as to whether it is affordable, certainly if borrowing just keeps going up and up and up, and we're struggling to pay back the interest, right? So if that dynamic wasn't happening with respect to the debt, then one could say, okay, her argument is a bit stronger. And also, if it wasn't such a big burden on income tax, then again, people might buy into it, right? But when you have a situation where the debt isn't coming down sufficiently, it is coming down, but not sufficiently, you're still running in a deficit, so you've not achieved your surplus yet. The surplus has been forecast. And the way to keep this going just means increasing income taxes, therefore by eroding the standard of living and driving up the cost of living, because you have to take tax into account because tax is unavoidable. It becomes harder to sell what she's selling, right? That's the problem she's having right now. And I don't think she really fully understands this. She understands it economically, to be fair to her, but I don't think she fully understands how burdensome this can feel for workers in particular.
And economic growth, the best means to improve wages, create jobs, and support public services. That is what our plan, that is what this government and our Prime Minister are all about. Today's budget builds on the choices that we have made since July last year. To cut NHS waiting lists, to cut the cost of living, and to cut debt and borrowing. No doubt we will face opposition again, but I have yet to see a credible or a fairer alternative plan for working people.
So again, these are all fine to say, you want to lower waiting lists, you want to protect public services, and also lower debt, which is obviously something I've just talked about. And then saying, okay, I haven't seen a credible alternative plan. I'm not sure that's entirely fair, because as I say, there's more than one way to skin a cat. And I think at the moment we understand Reform and Conservatives' ideology around this, and even the Green Party, right? To a certain degree, we understand what their view is, at least from an ideological perspective. And their answer is you need to prioritize cutting debt more so. You can't keep raising income taxes, or if you can, you need to mitigate that. But the first place you go, the first pot you attack in terms of dealing with debt is public spend, right? So they prioritize lower taxes over public spend. That's the simplest way to think about this. Whilst the Chancellor, the Labour Chancellor, will prioritize maintaining public services over lowering taxes. So both will want to lower taxes. It's just where does it sit in their list of priorities? So for Reform and the Conservatives, lowering taxes is higher up their priority, whilst for Labour, it's lower down their priority relative to protecting public services. So the Conservatives and Reform, for example, do have a credible plan. It's just whether you buy into it or you don't, right? And Labour arguably have a credible plan in the sense that it's a plan. It is credible. It could work if implemented properly. So I'm not sure I would agree with that criticism that she's making around the fact that nobody's come up with a credible plan. I think they have. I think they haven't given us the detail, to be fair to her, but I don't think they actually need to at this stage. They're not in government. They're simply stating, look, you're going about this the wrong way. Here's some alternatives. This is the ideological, philosophical reasons why we think that's the case. Here's the logic behind it. That is their job at the moment, right? It's not to do their job for them in terms of producing an alternative budget. That doesn't make any sense to me.
These are my choices, the right choices for a fairer, a stronger and more secure Britain.
Order. Far too much noise, and I expected so much better from you, Dr. Luke Evans. You're meant to be a leader in your community. Simmer down, Chancellor.
I mean, this is ridiculous, right? In terms of like, you know, again, it depends how you view this, right? I mean, all this passion and all this noise and all this excitement could be viewed as a good thing in terms of, okay, these are really passionate people. They really care about what they're doing. You know, they're really emotionally invested in it. But then at the same time, they're adults, right? They're not school children. And they will have an opportunity to speak. There's decorum, right? You know, imagine if, you know, this was a bunch of guys outside a football stadium, for example, behaving like this. Imagine what these same politicians would say about those guys, right? They'd be judging them as like antisocial, aggressive, loud, intimidating. But because they're wearing suits and ties and sitting in a fancy building, somehow things are different, right? And then you have this lady sitting on a big chair, basically acting like, you know, some sort of school teacher. And then, you know, in the back of your mind, you're thinking about waste, right? You're just thinking about, there's all this stuff here that we're seeing that, you know, all this, you know, I don't know even what to call it, to be honest, but, you know, this procedure and this, you know, this nonsense. And so therefore we have to have this role specifically just to say to people, be quiet, you know, and you have to wonder, okay, well, what's she being paid and compensated? What does that role cost? Just to have someone sitting in a big chair saying, be quiet, everybody, behave yourself. Yeah, it's really strange.
I'm happy for them to shout as much as they like, Madam Deputy Speaker, as long as they do it from the opposition benches where they can't cause any more damage. I said there would be no return to austerity.
And I think that's fair in this environment, right? I mean, that's kind of the problem with this whole thing, in my view. It's like, because it's a place where you're allowed to take these sort of ridiculous, childish shots at people. And again, you've got this jeering in the background. I think the Chancellor is actually entitled to fire back in that regard, right? If you're trying to speak and everybody, you know, is making all this noise and jeering and laughing and catcalling, or not catcalling, but you know what I'm trying to say, like just being really unprofessional and not allowing her to speak, because you have to remember she is the Chancellor of the UK. There should be respect for that position, even if you don't respect her as an individual. And also the electorate are watching, right? They're not the only people this is for. She's talking to me, she's talking to you, she's talking to the world, and we need to hear what she's saying. So if they're not going to give her that opportunity because they have something to say and they're breaking procedural you know, rules and convention by interjecting, interrupting and jeering, then I think it's within her rights, as childish and as petty as it is, to make these, you know, sort of unconstructive comments, almost defend herself, right? I think that is actually okay.
And I meant it. This budget will maintain investment in our economy and in our National Health Service. I said I would cut the cost of living, and I meant it.
And again, I think this is the problem, right? So she talks about the cost of living and the fact she's cut it. But I think for me, the problem is she defines the cost of living in terms of interest rates and inflation. This is what she talked about in the pre-budget speech, right? She was so happy with herself for lowering inflation and lowering interest rates. And these are typically the things you would think about when talking about the cost of living, right? So she's not incorrect technically, right? Because that's conventional thinking. And what I'm about to say isn't radical thinking, it's just practical thinking, let's call it, right? Can you avoid taxes, right? And that's I guess that's a loaded question, right? But for someone that is paid a salary and is subject to PAYE, for somebody that buys things and sells things and is subject to sales taxes or VAT, for somebody who might die, well, we will die, and may have a estate to pass on to a beneficiary or a legacy, tax is basically an inevitability, right? You cannot really avoid it. You can avoid it if you've got the right accountants, I guess. But you understand what I'm trying to say fundamentally, right? So for me, tax is a cost of living, right? Variable. And if taxes go up, which she has put them up, which we'll come on to later on, then the cost of living has gone up. So the fact that she's arguing that she's got the cost of living down is a technical argument, but in substance, I would argue the cost of living has actually gone up. And the reason I'd also say that is because essential assets like homes have also gone up, more so than anything else. So again, when they look at inflation, they're not talking about home price inflation, that's not included, but that's something presumably most people would aspire to buying just for security reasons, right? If not anything else. So I'm not sure she has been successful actually in lowering the cost of living. I'd have to look into this, but I'm not going to give her credit for that now.
This budget will bring down inflation and provide immediate relief for families. I said,
and that's the point. She's specifically talking about inflation, right? That's for her cost of living, inflation and interest rates.
I would cut debt and borrowing, and I meant it. Because of this budget, borrowing will fall as a share of GDP in every year of this forecast.
And again, I do want to talk about this point as well. So she is saying, and I talked about this point as well, actually, in my last two videos, talking about Rachel Reeves's pre-budget speech and Nigel Farage's response to that. On the one hand, she gave the OBR forecast as not being certain because it's based on past results. And therefore, she reframed it to say, okay, look, I'm presenting a more optimistic view as to what potentially could happen in the future. Nigel Farage debunked that, rebutted it by saying, actually, you know, the forecast is to be interpreted a bit more as a certainty because it was basically negative. But now she's reverted back to saying, well, actually, I'm now forecasting the fact that the debt's going to come down. And she's presenting it like it's certainty again. So it's just interesting that, you know, these things haven't happened yet. So I don't think it's cause for celebration yet, regardless of how you see the forecast and how seriously you take it. If something hasn't happened, we think it's going to happen, then let's not count our, you know, eggs, you know, I don't know what the phrase is, but let's not count our hens before they've hatched, right? Let's just see what happens. So it's good that the projections are indicating things are improving, but it's not cause for celebration until things actually improve.
Net financial debt will be lower at the end of the forecast than it is today, and I will more than double the headroom against our stability rule to 20.
So again, she's saying that the forecast has been improved. So I guess that's a good thing. She's saying she will double the headroom regarding her fiscal rules, basically meaning that, you know, she'll just get the level of debt down relative to GDP, I suppose. But that's a commitment, right? Which is good. So she's making another commitment. Whether we can trust it is a different question, but that's a commitment rather than something that's been achieved.
£21.7 billion, meeting our stability rule and meeting it a year early.
And I think, again, I do want to talk about the stability rule in terms of ideology again, because this won't matter to Reform or the Conservatives, right? So let's just assume everything she said about hitting her metrics, about hitting her fiscal rules, about getting GDP down. Not GDP, debt down relative to GDP. Let's say she achieved every single thing she said she was going to do. And let's even say, actually, that the cost of living had come down and she didn't raise taxes. Let's just imagine she just sort of alchemied her way into this scenario. Reform and Conservatives would still criticize it. And anybody that has that ideological way of thinking will still criticize it. And the reason they'll criticize it is because they simply just don't have the same view as to how an economy should run and how growth should be driven. And the only analogy I can give you around this is, again, if we think about the private sector. So in the private sector, you might have an AI business, you might have a SaaS business, and these businesses, broadly speaking, if you ignore development costs, will be operationally very, very lean, right? The main cost they will have is people. That will be the main cost. There will be some licenses and software and cloud services they're relying on, but this will be just recurring costs. And then they'll just generate profits. So it'll be a very lean business from an infrastructure perspective, and it won't require huge amounts of capital investment, for example, because that is not how the business makes its money. So that is kind of how possibly the Conservatives and certainly the Reform might view an economic engine, right? Costs should be really, really low, whilst at the same time maximizing revenues, right? Labour, on the other hand, are kind of more like a large industrial factory or a big sort of capital projects, real estate type business, where actually the level of debt is actually very, very high, right? But it's expected and it's understood that it should be relatively high compared to a SaaS business because it needs a lot of cash up front to build things that will then generate money. But in that regard, what you should then see is that business model generates far more income than not doing the investment in the first place, right? And that's probably more the way Labour would see the economic engine, right? So they just believe essentially what they're thinking and the way they view things will naturally just lead to high levels of debt. And ultimately, what Conservatives and Reform will be saying is, well, actually, we don't want to see this level of debt. We want to see less debt, but that also means we want to see less public expenditure, and therefore you don't need all that debt. So but again, it's just a way of like viewing things. It doesn't necessarily really matter what the level of debt is actually, as long as you can repay it, right? And that's the problem ultimately Rachel Reed is having, as far as I'm concerned. To some degree, the level of debt is not great, but my main concern is not really the level of debt, it's the fact that we're struggling to repay it. And I don't think necessarily, even if you would take the view of Reform or the Conservatives, you would end up in a situation where whatever level of debt you've taken on, if you're not collecting tax receipts, then you're going to struggle to repay that debt as well, even if it's very, very low.
These are my choices. Not austerity, not borrowing, not turning a blind eye to unfairness.
Right, and again, that emphasizes my point, right? Her choice is not austerity. Her choice is not to cut public expenditure, but that's an ideological position. One I'm inclined to agree with, just based on my own personal view, but it's her choice she's making, which is why whatever she'd achieved, she's always going to get criticized by the other side.
My choices are a budget for fair taxes, strong public services and a stable economy. That is the Labour choice. Growth is the engine that carries every one of our ambitions forward through stability, investment and reform.
Again, I've got my own personal view about what she's just said there. So what she said is that growth is the engine that carries everything forward. And to some degree, I understand what she's trying to say here. Like, we need to grow in order to borrow, in order to invest, right? And then you have to invest to have the public services you need. So that I get. But my issue ultimately with growth is that it's not the thing necessarily that results in improving living standards, for example. Because when you have growth, much of the wealth goes to a very, very small number of individuals through dynamics we've talked about, and Gary Stevenson, for example, talks about. So, and what you expect to address that and remediate that effect is having a fair tax system, which is something she just mentioned. And again, I don't think the tax system is fair. So therefore, even if you're getting all this growth, I don't think it's going to lead to the social impacts that she's expecting. I.e., will we be in a situation where, because we have more growth, homes become more affordable? Because we have more growth, income tax, for example, will come down. I don't think income tax will come down, even if there's more growth, actually, because the cost of doing the things she wants to do also go up with inflation. Whatever inflation is, it will affect public expenditure as well. You've got to pay for contractors, you've got to pay people that are going to ask for more money in the public sector, you've got to pay for materials, and also you've got to pay to basically compensate for this disruption of doing things as well. So if you think about fixing a road, there's a lot of contractors and subcontractors involved in order to make that happen, right? And to negotiate with the relevant parties to organize things. So that cost will always go up. And if you're always going to turn to income tax, essentially, to deal with this, I don't know if we're going to end up in a situation where you have where you have this wealth gap reducing, right? I think the wealth gap will just keep increasing, even in an environment where economically, from a GDP perspective, you're actually looking quite successful, perversely.
The platform from which British ambition can finally get moving again. Because growth doesn't just appear out of thin air. It is built patiently and stubbornly by people who take risks, by founders who bet their savings on an idea, by firms breaking into new markets, developing new technologies and creating new jobs and new opportunities, by the men and the women who work hard every day in all parts of our country. Our job is not to watch from the sidelines, but to partner with them, backing them every step of the way, to match private enterprise with public ambition. I would like to thank my team of officials at the Treasury for their hard work in preparing this budget. In the spring, the Office of Budget Responsibility forecast that our economy would grow by 1% this year. I said then that Britain would defy the forecasts, and defy them we have. The OBR have upgraded Britain's growth for this year from 1% to 1.5%.
Oh God. That's not great. And again, the context behind the forecast, right? So they've upgraded the forecast to 1.5%. So again, it's a forecast, it's not certain, it's not delivered yet. But also, I wouldn't call this defying like your targets, right? That's almost a rounding error. Like I'm sure it's not, because 1.5 on GDP is a massive, 0.5% on GDP is a massive number in absolute terms. But I wouldn't, to frame this as defying, massively overachieving on something is crazy. It's just ridiculous. So no brownie points for that. And then all the other stuff she talked about with respect to entrepreneurs. Again, I think that's about reform. Again, if you would have heard Nigel Farage's response to a pre-budget speech, it was very clear about who his champions are, right? And what he's going to do for them if he comes into power. And I think Labour are basically stealing a march there, and sort of realizing actually we need to talk about this, because again there is a feeling that it's harder to do business in this country. Certainly when you think about the increase to NI, workers NI, for example, and therefore, and a lot of startups actually are not incorporating themselves in the UK. They're going to other countries, other jurisdictions. And also they've been very aggressive with some of the incentive schemes as well. So they've become less generous with R&D credits, for example. And the schemes that are currently in place with respect to incentivizing and keeping workers and getting investment have also not really moved with inflation, right? So the number needs to move, like with income tax bands. You would expect the level of investment that is possible, that is protected by these reliefs, to increase with inflation as well, and that hasn't happened. And it's something Nigel Farage called out. I'm not aware of anybody else calling out before him specifically. So I think, this is where I think good, effective opposition is actually. It's forced Labour to think about and address something they might not otherwise have done so. And that is what I mean about effective opposition. So I think reform can take credit, in my view, for this based on what I've observed.
Reaching the same conclusions as the IMF, the OECD and the Bank of England.
And the reason they're jeering, again, it's very annoying, but the reason they're jeering is because it's not the conclusion subjectively those, the Bank of England or the OBR have come to. They have simply revised the figure, but they're not concluding that Labour have defied the odds. That's basically what I'm saying. So this idea that they're in agreement is again misleading and spin, right? They're not in agreement, objectively speaking. They're just basically substantiating the fact that the forecast is better than expected. That's as much as you can say to give Rachel Reeves credit. That's as far as I'm going to go. But to argue that they're in agreement that Labour have defied all expectations is a crazy statement.
Have already upgraded their forecasts. Today, the OBR have published the result of their review of the supply side of the economy. They are clear that this is not about the last 14 months. It is about the previous 14 years. The legacy of Brexit and the pandemic, and the damaging decisions by the party opposite.
Okay, so the reason that's important, because in her, I think it was the pre-budget speech again, I think if I remember correctly, she talked about commissioning a report looking into supply chain. And before the results coming out, she was confident enough to basically say that, the damage had been done by the other party. That report is now completed based on what she's saying now. And funnily enough, it precisely confirms what she thought was going on all along. Now, again, I'll let you make of that what you will, considering it was a report she'd asked for and who those people are serving. Then the other thing I'd also say as well is that she's mentioned COVID and Brexit. Now, again, what my argument would be is what would Labour have done in those positions, right? How would they have dealt with that? Because if you're pro-business, then, and you're pro-workers, then following kind of makes sense, right? Especially if you're pro-small businesses. And I know many businesses that relied on furloughing to keep going, otherwise they would have gone insolvent. And then if you care about well-being and if you care about controlling a pandemic, then what happens when COVID happens? Like what do you do, right? So Brexit is something the electorate decided, not any government. The government just gave them the choice. So that's the electorate's bad. That's our bad. COVID is a sort of black swan event, so to speak. It's not something anyone can do anything about. My only criticism would be around the financial crash, actually, where there was a lot of bailouts. But even then, they had to do it in a sense because the banks were too big to fail. If we allowed the banks to fail, we'd all lost our money. So I'm not really sure. Again, I think it's fair for anybody to start criticizing anybody around furloughing and COVID and the impact that had on national debt. Yes, things could have been done better, but I'm personally not of the view that's the Conservatives' fault, just because they happen to be the ruling government at that particular point in time. I think Labour would have also struggled, and I think Reform would have struggled, and I think the Greens would have struggled. I think any government would have seriously struggled with that situation. It was a really, really tough and big situation. And yes, they could have done better, but, you know, Labour are not in a position to say they would have done better from what I'm seeing.
Cutting public spending, leaving communities and entire regions behind, starving our economy of investment and weakening our public services. As a result of their review, the OBR are reducing their expectations for productivity growth by 0.3 percentage points to 1% by the end of the forecast. They say today, and I quote, real GDP is forecast to grow by 1.5% on average over the forecast due to lower underlying productivity growth. There is an impact on our public finances too. The OBR say that their productivity forecast will mean £16 billion less in tax receipts by 2030.
This is all bad news, right? So she's talking about productivity going down, despite the fact she's expecting GDP to go up. She's talking about less tax receipts. But did you notice, I certainly noticed anyway, the elements of the forecast that are good are thanks to Labour and the work she's done and her decisions. And the elements that are bad are a result of legacy issues in the last 14 years. So that's the general sense, again, of this assessment of the OBR's forecast that Rachel Reeves is presenting here.
These forecasts are the Tories' legacy, not Britain's.
There you go. There you go. All the rubbish. You guys over there, Conservatives. Anything, any cherry-picked elements that we enjoy, that we like, that are good, we'll have that. Thank you very much. Politics 101.
We beat the forecasts this year and we will beat them again.
By 0.5%. Well done.
By boosting trade, not blocking it. By increasing investment, not cutting it. By championing innovation, not stifling it. By backing working people, not making them poorer.
Again, I want to interject there. I think Reform, the Greens, or any party, the Conservatives, would say exactly the same thing apart from spending. They would say everything else. So just bear that in mind, in my opinion, right? I think the main bone of contention is the level of expenditure. Everything else you said, I think everybody in that room would agree with, apart from the level of investment, the level of spend, for ideological reasons, to be clear. No one's right, no one's wrong. You're not right, you're not wrong if you think it should be less spending or more spending. That's your own opinion. You know, you see the world how you want to see it. But that is the bone of contention here. What is actually affordable? It's the question I've got in my mind as well, right? I know where I line politically, and I'm someone that would like to see investment in the country, that would like to see the state, you know, do more. But it needs to be affordable. I think everybody, regardless of what side of the fence you sit on politically, would agree with that. So that's the issue here with this budget. Is it credible from an affordability perspective? And that's always been historically Conservatives' criticism of Labour, right? The party of spend, right? Not investment, right? And that's a clear distinction. Spending is wasteful. Investment is constructive, right? You get a return on your investment. And that's probably why that is the word Rachel Reeves is using much more than anything else, right? So she's saying she's giving more money to the NHS, which you could just say is spend, but she's calling it investment, right? And it's your own view as to whether you see it as investment or spend.
Brick by brick, we've been building our economy. Building roads, building homes, getting spades in the ground and cranes in the sky.
And that's why she's talking about those things, right? Roads, homes, cranes, planes in the sky. Whether they're affordable is a different question, but she's building them.
Growth begins with a spark of an entrepreneur. Half of new jobs in Britain are created by scale-up businesses. And we want those jobs created here, not somewhere else. Our job is to make Britain the best place in the world to start up, to scale up and to stay. So we're widening eligibility for our enterprise incentives, so scale-ups can attract the talent and the capital that they need. Expanding the enterprise management incentive so more companies can offer tax-relieved share options. Re-engineering our enterprise investment and venture capital trust schemes so they don't just back early-stage ideas, but stay with companies as they grow. Introducing UK listings relief, a 3-year exemption from stamp duty reserve tax for companies who choose to list here in Britain. And to continue this work, I am launching a call for evidence on how our tax system can better back entrepreneurs, and a targeted review with founders and investors at the heart to make the UK an even more attractive place to grow your business.
Okay, so again, as I mentioned before, she said a lot of things there, which I'll cover, in summary. But essentially, I think this has been because of the pressure placed on her by Reform in particular, but also the Conservatives, right? And the criticisms they've made about this country, and how, would-be entrepreneurs view setting up business and doing business in this country relative to how it was in the past. And again, that's an example, in my view, of effective opposition where they're forcing the hand of the ruling party to address something and offer something, right? And much of what she's offered is actually good, but to be very, very clear, it must be tax funded, right? So she's foregoing tax in order to do these things, which we're then as workers paying for, right? So these things will grow the GDP number and make the GDP number overall bigger, or give it more chance of being bigger by attracting more businesses, which hopefully are successful. They'll employ people. Those people will pay taxes, but it's those individuals that are working for these companies in more so than anyone that is going to have to pay the taxes to fund all these initiatives she's just described for these businesses. So the first thing she talked about, excuse me, the first thing she talked about was the EIS and SEIS schemes. So these are the small, I think there's a seed enterprise investment scheme and the enterprise investment schemes. And these were limited to about £3 million of investment, I believe. I can't remember the exact number, but there's a limit on it. And this allows early investors, potentially pre-seed investors, to invest in a business and receive tax relief off their income tax bill, right? So it incentivizes placing your money in a UK business that is eligible for this scheme. So it's very good for business. It's very good for the investor, right? And it encourages more investment rather than them putting their money in, say, the NASDAQ or the S&P 500, for example, or just putting it away and saving it. So that is good. So it just means that businesses have more chance of finding capital, of finding investment. Good. Then she talks about the Enterprise Management Incentive Scheme, which is called EMI, and the larger scheme is called CSOP. And these are tax-approved option schemes. So what a business can do when it says, okay, look, I want to give you a job, but I'm struggling for cash because I've only just had my first round of investment. I've got a limited runway. I can only run this business if cash doesn't improve for like another 6 months, let's say. Therefore, I can only offer you this salary at like 50% of the market rate. So the salary would normally be 100,000. I can only offer you 50,000. But what I will do is I'll make up the difference with options, which will vest over 3 years. So that basically means in 3 years' time, provided that you stay with the business and you perform, you will get £50,000 worth of shares in this company, which may be worth 2% of the company or 3% of the company, let's say. So it's a way of attracting talent that stays with the business, grows with the business, and therefore they also get a benefit from that business. So in that sense, it's good for the worker as well. And then she talked about some other schemes as well, which I can't remember, something about grants and venture capital, as well as investigating other things she can do like this to incentivize fintechs and scale-ups and startups incorporating themselves and hiring people actually in the UK. Because again, these schemes are only eligible for UK workers. So on the face of it, it's really, really good, right? And it's something I definitely buy into. But I think it's in direct response to Nigel Farage's criticisms around the fact that you've got workers leaving the country, you've got businesses not wanting to start here. You know, the taxes are too high on these businesses, the burden is too big, and therefore Labour have had to come up with something to address this. But another thing you need to remember about all of this is that by doing this, Labour is forgoing tax receipts from these people. So they're forgoing tax receipts from the investors that are investing through these schemes. They're forgoing taxes around the options that are granted, because again, the options are a lower discounted amount rather than market amount. So therefore, they have a lower valuation. And they're forgoing the tax actually on the disposal or the exercise of those options as well. So basically just less tax. So they have to offset that with increasing taxes elsewhere, which is why it just creates more pressure on income tax. So that's the other dynamic you've got to take here. It's great, but it has its cons, and the cons is that it increases the income tax burden on workers.
We are sending a simple message to the world. If you build here, Britain will back you.
And that's the funny thing. These messages around building in Britain, building in the US, is always framed around low taxes. So that's something that I always find very, very interesting. And it's like, okay, you're forgoing taxes to incentivize and attract people and talent and entrepreneurs. So if you're committing to expenditure, you see where I'm going. Where does the tax come from?
And our retail investment system should do the same. The UK has some of the lowest levels of retail investment in the G7. And that is not only bad for business, who need that investment to grow, it's bad for savers too. Someone who has invested £1,000 a year in an average stocks and shares ISA every year since 1999 would be £50,000 better off today if they'd put that same money into if they'd put them same money into a cash ISA. And so,
okay, so that's good, but it's all easy in retrospect, right? That person, the problem is she's saying it like the person however many years ago, I should say. So let's imagine it was 10 years ago. If 10 years ago, if you'd put £1,000 in a shares ISA, it would have grown £50,000 more by the end of that 10 years than putting it in an interest only savings, cash savings ISA. You wouldn't have known that 10 years ago. Like so it's a weird way of framing it, right? You wouldn't have known with certainty that the stock market would have outpaced the savings account. Like typically it will, but your money's at risk when you buy shares and you don't know how they're going to perform. Like if there was a crash in the middle of that, then she couldn't say that same thing, right? So that's the problem, right? Hindsight doesn't take into account the fact that you don't have future knowledge, which is why cash shares are not attractive to people because of the level of risk. So it's just a weird way of framing that, right? Even though it's kind of true. It's true that you would have done better if you'd put it in shares, but you can't have known that for certain anyway 10 years ago or whenever it is you started buying shares as opposed to putting your money in a cash ISA.
From April 2027, I will reform our ISA system, keeping the full £20,000 allowance while designating 8,000 of it exclusively for investment.
Right, so reforming is an odd choice of words. It's not reforming a scheme by making the scheme less generous. It's just reflecting. She's reforming it in the sense that it's now aligned with her ideology, but it's not really reformed. It's just less. It's just more restrictive, I would argue. But to be honest with you, I think the change is good. So when I first heard about this, and I had a video about what I thought was going to happen in the budget, and I predicted, I think at the time, I'd have to double check what I said, but I think I predicted that there would be no change because it would be very, very unpopular. and I was wrong on that, if that's what I predicted. But I think the way she's navigated this, I do have to give her credit actually, because it only affects those under 65, right? So if you're 65 or older, which is kind of aligned with retirement age, you're going to be more reliant on your cash ISA. Like you don't have time necessarily to, wait out the market and see what happens, right? Because these growth figures she's giving are over a long period of time. If you put it in a diversified, fund, for example, or if you just get some sort of ETF, for example, which has exposure to all sorts of different things, you're looking at a long lead time before you see that kind of return, so that you can ride out the lows. Whilst with a cash ISA, and you're not earning a salary, you're relying on your pension. You need to see this certain recurring income, right? Certainly, if you're now getting more taxed, which is typically seems to be the case as pensioners as we're seeing more and more pensioners, more and more of them are subject to tax. So you want certainty around your income. So the fact that she's saying it's not including over 65s is good, because that was the major concern I had. It encourages young people to think about shares, which I think is good. And I think the limit by 8K, I believe it is, so it's reducing it from 20K to 12K, I think is okay, right? 12K is still good. It's not great, but most people that are looking to use this struggle to use the £20,000 allowance anyway, right? And even those that have that kind of money typically tend to lean more towards the shares ISA anyway. So I think the effect of it is good, but I'm quite cynical of the reasons, because the reason will ultimately mean that more of your savings, your cash savings, if you're below 65 years old, is exposed to tax, right? And she needs more tax. So in the context of the situation she's in, the reasons behind this reform, I view quite cynically, but the net result of where we've ended up, I actually view it quite positively.
With over 65s retaining the full cash allowance. And thanks to our changes to financial advice and guidance, banks will be able to guide savers to better choices for their hard-earned money.
I don't think that's the right approach. I think it needs to start in schools. Having banks encourage, people to put their money in shares when they don't have the confidence based on knowledge is not a good idea, right? I don't agree with that approach at all. And I think it's very short-sighted, if I'm being honest.
Over 50% of the ISA market, including Hargreaves Lansdown, HSBC, Lloyds, Vanguard and Barclays, have signed up to launch new online hubs to help people invest here in Britain.
But they need to have the knowledge and the confidence to do it, right? It's not a lack of willingness. So there's two issues. Firstly, how much disposable income do people have? And much of the changes she's going to announce will reduce the level of disposable income that people have. So that's the first thing. But ultimately, the main thing is education, right? And confidence. If people are not educated on the markets and investments and shares, it doesn't matter what you tell them. They're not going to feel comfortable doing it. And then the moment they see their shares reduce in value, it will create a level of anxiety that they're not accustomed to. So do you really want to put people through that unless they're educated, right? And if you think about any platform you've used for investing, if you look at the CFD module, the first thing they want to know is, are you a sophisticated investor? Are you educated? And I think that's right. Like, you shouldn't be doing these things, whether it's a good idea or a bad idea, if you are not educated. And I don't mean that in a disrespectful way, but what I'm trying to say is that people are not prepared in schools. And a lot of content creators have talked about, teaching finances in school, like, common finances, basic finances, personal finances in schools. But the reality is that doesn't really happen. And therefore, when people get older, they're not familiar with things like credit cards and mortgages, buy to let, these things that are just sort of taken for granted and you can't just learn. when you're an adult. People just are not comfortable with these things. So until you make it, more normal, and until you normalize it, in the younger generation, you're always going to have this fear, I think, with the people you're trying to encourage to invest, because they're just not going to, they're gonna just struggle with the fact that the market is volatile.
At this budget, consistent with the commitments in our corporate tax roadmap, I will retain our competitive corporation tax rate, the lowest in the G7, and retain our generous full expensing offer for business investments. I will also introduce a new 40% first-year allowance so that businesses can write off more of the cost of their investment up front, while reducing main rate writing down allowances in line with fiscal constraints.
And again, that's important, right? So I've talked about this before in previous videos around when governments want to attract business, when they want to attract talent, they just throw in loads of tax relief. So we talked about the EIS and the SEIS previously. We're now talking about corporation tax and how you can now accelerate some of those reliefs. So when she's talking about this 40% upfront, expensing more things, basically what it means is that you're accelerating the speed in which you're getting these tax reliefs, and therefore you have more cash at your disposal, right? So the context of all of this is important because it's good for business, it's good for growth, but it's also good for the business owner, right? So when these business owners say, I took this massive risk, I did it all by myself, I came from nothing, in a sense, that is true, right? They have taken risks, they have come from nothing, they have gone through massive personal struggles that some of us will never have gone through and will never understand. But equally, they've had a lot of assistance from the government, indirectly from the taxpayer who's funding all of this, to give them the best chance of making their business successful. So the value of their business is indirectly and positively impacted by all this foregone tax that is being paid for and subsidized by us, the taxpayer. So you would hope that is acknowledged in terms of, okay, now that I've become this successful business person and I've made all this money, thanks to all the initiatives this country has given me in terms of the tax regime, in terms of the fantastic workers I've been able to attract at discounted rates because of EMI, I understand implicitly that I should also pay my fair share of taxes. And I think many entrepreneurs do understand that. But I think the reason I'm reiterating this is because I want to be very clear about my own ideology around things like a wealth tax, right? This idea that, we shouldn't have too aggressive taxes on business owners, I think for me is a fallacy in the sense that they shouldn't be aggressive on anybody, right? But if they are aggressive, they should be aggressive for everybody. Like whatever the tax position is, whether it's aggressive or not aggressive, everybody should have the same burden, right? And if we're finding there's a demographic, whether they're entrepreneurs, whether they're poor people, or whether it's very, very rich people, I think we need to look at that, especially if we're thinking that we have a progressive tax system.
Private investment is the lifeblood of economic growth, but growth needs public investment too. When faced with challenges, previous chancellors have chosen to decrease, delay, or cancel capital spending. But low investment is the cause of our productivity problem, not the solution.
Yeah, so that might sound strange as to why public expenditure would create an issue, because especially when she's framed public expenditure essentially as infrastructure, right? And why that would affect productivity. So in simplistic terms, the only thing I can conclude is that you're just going to be less productive if you're struggling to get to work. And this is something she talked about in her pre-budget speech, for example, right? If it's difficult to get to work, or you can't get to work, or it's harder to do construction work because there's delays on the road in terms of getting the materials there, getting labor there, so therefore you're missing your deadlines in terms of construction projects, for example, because again, infrastructure is really bad. That is a way where what she's saying might make sense, right? So I did want to pull out that point because it might not seem obvious what she means when she says not having public investment affects your GDP, productivity, and efficiency, right? because that's the only thing I personally can think she means, outside of those tax reliefs that she talked about, which go directly to specific companies that qualify.
So my choice is not cuts, not stagnation, but to maintain the additional £120 billion of investment that I provided at the spending review. In transport, to link our towns and our cities, energy infrastructure to power our businesses, and housing, so people can live near good jobs, paying decent wages and growing businesses.
That's it right there. All right. So you've got to live near your work. You've got to be able to have reliable, roads to get from your home near work to work. Energy costs need to be low. So yeah, it's about infrastructure, and how that then interacts with productivity, as she defined it, which is product efficiency. So yeah, that sort of ties it all together for me.
As the Labour choice. I'm grateful to the Financial Secretary to the Treasury for his work in driving our growth agenda forward. As we allocate investment for the infrastructure that is the backbone of economic growth across our country, today I will commit investment for the Lower Thames Crossing. And we're continuing to drive investment in city region transport, in the Midlands Rail Hub and the Transpennine Route upgrade, along with our commitments to the Northern Growth Corridor, including Northern Powerhouse Rail.
Okay, and that's also good, right? So she's justifying this additional expenditure, or the same level of expenditure, her commitments around this, which of course are going to cost us more money in terms of taxes, because it will help address somewhat this regional divide in terms of economic growth, right? So typically economic growth is centered around the south. And again, that connection and infrastructure that we described that helps productivity from an efficiency point of view has also been focused on the south. So if you can improve those things in other regions, that is a good thing. But as I say, it's at a cost to the taxpayer. And again, you've got to decide whether you think that's worthwhile or not.
It is this Labour government that has overhauled our planning system, and I will today provide further funding to increase planning capacity through a new skills offer, as called for by the British Chamber of Commerce and the Confederation of British Industry. It is this Labour government that has invested in nuclear power, in Sizewell C and in Culham.
Yep, so again, I think that's good. I think nuclear power needs to be thought about. And again, it was something Nigel Farage called out certainly as well, but he was not new to that, nuclear power argument. But again, I just wanted to acknowledge the fact that Reform have also talked about that. But yes, nuclear power, yes, it's huge risks, which is why it needs to be done carefully and safely. You can't do shortcuts with this kind of stuff. You can't take shortcuts with things like health and safety and regulation, as far as I'm concerned, which again, Nigel Farage had a very different view on that side of things. But my own view is you definitely need to think about nuclear energy, because energy demands are only going up, certainly with AI, for example. And it needs to be done in a way that is very, very safe, so as to not put people in harm's way.
Taking forward our commitment to slash electricity prices for thousands of manufacturing businesses, as Make UK and many others have called for. And today I'm pleased to welcome John Finkelton's report, an ambitious plan to cut the red tape that has tied our nuclear industry in knots for decades.
And the thing is, she's mentioned some individuals there who I don't know. And it was a criticism I had of Nigel Farage when he had his response to the pre-budget speech, because again, he was just mentioning names. But the reason why I'm not going to criticize Rachel Reeves in the same way is because the other thing she said was report, right? So again, I don't know the credentials of the person she described. I don't know if they have any political affiliations. Again, they could be a Labour agent. Who knows? They could be completely biased. But the point I'm making is that they produced studies, right? She's citing a report. She's cited a study. It may be terrible. I don't know. It might be credible. Who knows, right? But that has a bit more weight than just saying someone's name. And that's the key distinction here between why I criticize Nigel Farage, whilst I'm not being so critical on Rachel Reeves on the same point.
And within 3 months, we will set out our plan for delivering his recommendations. We are proud of our industrial heritage, and we are determined to build the industry of the future so that we buy, make and sell more here in Britain.
That's good. And I think, again, that's a response to Nigel Farage's criticisms around the fact that this country is de-industrializing. It's not. It's de-industrializing in terms of some of the old things we used to do, like, like oil and coal and that kind of stuff. But then you've got to think about renewable energy and what's happening there. And there is an opportunity to industrialize with respect to sustainable energy, which I think the UK is starting to do. His criticism was that a lot of that was happening, abroad, and that arguably might be true. But what I'm trying to say is that it's not an objective fact to say that this country is de-industrializing. It's just moving away from old forms of energy production and thinking about more sustainable, newer, more future-looking ways of producing energy, i.e. nuclear energy, for example. So I think it's good that this economy reflects that. But as I say, in order to do that, in order to re-industrialize, the government must have money, right? They must be able to afford to do this. And the only way they're going to do this is if the taxpayer pays for it.
That's why, as we increase defence spending, we are investing in Portsmouth, in Barrow and in Plymouth. And I'm pleased to be supporting Team Derby, an initiative to drive growth in one of our defence industry hubs. It's why we stepped in to save British Steel in Scunthorpe and invested in Sheffield Forge Masters. And it's why we've changed government procurement so we can buy British when it is crucial to our national security.
That's also good. Your supply chain with respect to national defence should be domestic. So this is where protectionism comes into play, right? So again, when it comes to running a country, and this is something I've mentioned again in previous videos, simply adopting a business model will not always make sense, because if you adopt a business model, then you're agnostic around where you're sourcing products from for defenses, right? Your defense procurement or supply chain is agnostic of country. It just doesn't care where it comes from. It's just which is the cheapest, which is the best, right? The best, most sort of high quality product. But that might come from Germany, for example. But from a national security perspective, does that actually make sense? Maybe it does, maybe it doesn't, right? So I think for me, it is good that you have a more of a protectionist ideology around your supply chain when it pertains to national defense, for example.
And I'm making targeted investments in our industrial strategy sectors across the UK. In Northern Ireland, I am providing £17 million to support businesses and strengthen the UK internal market, and backing advanced manufacturing through the Northern Ireland Enhanced Investment Zone. Wales will be the host for 2 AI growth zones, creating more than 8,000 jobs, supported by a £10 million investment in the semiconductors critical for that industry. And we are building the UK's first small modular nuclear reactors with Rolls-Royce at Wilfer in Anglesey.
Yeah, so I think that's a good example of protectionism, right? So, because again, energy is critical to national security, which is why Rolls-Royce, assuming they're owned by British stakeholders, because again, we think of Rolls-Royce as a British company, but who's the majority shareholder of Rolls-Royce, right? It may be somebody who is not British, so bear that in mind. But in theory, that is potentially a good example of protectionism, whereby you develop some technology which is critical to national security, i.e. nuclear energy, and then you're using presumably British workers and a British company, presumably, i.e. Rolls-Royce, to deliver that work. And again, it might be at a higher premium than going globally, which is what capitalism would require, free markets would require. But as I say, that's not always appropriate when you're thinking about running a country.
A growing economy needs strong foundations of economic stability, with borrowing, inflation down and investment up. That is good for business, and it is good for working people, so they have more money in their pockets.
It is if you don't raise taxes. Again, I really do need to stress this. And I know it sounds like I'm being disingenuous, let's say, but you can't, generally speaking, avoid taxes. You can only defer them, right? There's reliefs that the governments may offer people, but generally speaking, tax is inevitable. Tax and death are inevitabilities. So taxing, as far as I'm concerned, is part of your cost of living. And if you tax more, you're not lowering the cost of living.
Economic stability, safeguarded by ironclad fiscal rules, is our best defence against rising prices and the best way to improve living standards.
I don't think it's the best defence against rising prices. It's the best defence against the rising borrowing of cost. The rising cost of borrowing, for example. But if you can borrow more, which is what Labour wants to do relative to its opposition, then the thing you're looking to buy, especially if it's an asset and it's limited, actually goes up. More borrowing and more financing activity tends to drive the cost or the value of rare or restricted or limited assets or desired resources upwards, which are then hoarded by high net worth individuals who are looking to diversify their wealth for risk management reasons. So they're not doing anything. So these high net worth individuals are not doing anything wrong. And I don't want to demonize these people. They're just doing what any of us would do, right? You don't want exposure. You don't want all your eggs in one basket, right? You want to diversify your exposure. So you buy assets. And if there's cheaper financing and we're all borrowing more because the cost of living is too high, what happens to assets? So when she says keeping the price of things down, she might be talking about consumables, but we're not just talking about consumables when you think about what people need. We're thinking also about land. We're thinking also about homes. And what she's talked about, actually, investing, right? If you have less money in your pocket, you can't take advantage of her reform of the ISA scheme. So yeah, it can be frustrating because it's like the full picture is not really being considered. And this is why, unfortunately, people perceive politicians as being out of touch. This is part of the reason, as far as I'm concerned.
Seen the alternative. 3 years ago, in their clamour to cut taxes for the richest, the Tories under Liz Truss crashed the economy and sent mortgage rates spiralling and brought pensions to the brink.
So this is true. And it's hard for the Conservatives to live that down. But the reason why Rachel Reeves needs to be careful is because the reason that happened was because it was unfunded, right? There was no confidence. There was no OBR forecast at the time. They just they just sort of went around convention, and therefore the markets had no confidence that what they were doing was funded. They didn't actually have an issue ideologically with the fact that the Conservatives wanted to reduce taxes on the richest. If anything, that is the position Reform has now, right? In some ways, they want to take entrepreneurs and they want to make sure that they're incentivized to be here. And part of that is to lower taxes that they face. That's why they want to get rid of the IR35 rule, for example. So that is not the reason. The reason it was not is that it was unaffordable. And that's the same challenge she has now. Whatever it is she wants to present with respect to her economy, that focuses more on public expenditure and public investment, which aligns with my own ideology, to be clear. The question is it affordable? And that is what the markets are concerned about, because they want their debt repaid. So it's not really about the fact that, Liz Truss lowered taxes on the very rich. That's why the market weren't unhappy. It's a bit misleading because that's the inference or the implied conclusion of what she just said. When actually it's more of an objective position. It's more around, you government do what you want to do, just make sure you pay us back. That's kind of all it is, really.
They've been so loud, Madam Deputy Speaker, and yet I can't even hear them now. Now, I know that the leader of the Green Party is a keen hypnotherapist, and he believes that he can achieve remarkable things using only the power of his mind.
it's funny because many people you speak to that achieve things do credit their success to hypnotherapy, to therapy, and the power of the mind. I mean, how did she get to where she was, the first female chancellor in this country, without having that conviction in her own mind? So, yes, it's funny what she's saying. I get where she's coming from. You know, you can spin it that way. It's an acceptable way to spin it, right? I think she's entitled to make that assessment of the leader of the Green Party, Zach Polanski. But the truth is, you can frame it a different way. And my own position is arguing to somebody's competence or incompetence just because of what they do is playing into the hands of reform. So that's the first thing to take into account, right? Because the criticism of her has been leveled that she's incompetent because she's not had the relevant experience, either in the Treasury or in the private sector. She's now taking that same approach and attacking somebody else, pretty random actually, from the grand scheme of things, considering the fact that her main opponent is Kemi Badenoch, and talking about the power of the mind like that's a bad thing. I know I have to have self-belief in order to achieve anything. And I think most people that are successful will probably say something similar. The power of the mind is really important. And that conviction, even delusions of grandeur to some degree, fake it till you make it. It's a cliche for a reason.
Unfortunately, the only things getting bigger under his approach would be the deficit and the rate of inflation.
She doesn't know that. For the same reason she argues that a forecast isn't certain.
And for all the damage that the Conservative cuts did to our schools and our hospitals, they also doubled the national debt. Our net financial...
Again, the Conservatives were in power during COVID. I'm not sure about the banking crisis. That might have been Labour, actually. I can't remember. That was in 2008, I believe. But COVID and the furloughing was certainly things that were being dealt with by the Conservatives. And as I say, I'm not convinced in those two scenarios in particular, that the Labour government would have not found themselves with a massively increased debt burden as well. All right, so I'm not convinced by that argument. I'm not saying the Conservatives are perfect. I'm not defending them. I'm just holding them to the same standard as I would any government at that time. And I'm not convinced Labour would have done a better job. They may have not done a worse job. I just think the situation was so dire, they just felt they had no alternative but to do what they did. And it would have saved a lot of businesses, which we're now benefiting from now. So this 1% growth she's talking about now, would that have happened without the intervention of the Conservative government with respect to furloughing, right? Can she answer that question? Because if she can, convincingly, then okay, maybe I can take her criticism here. But if she can't take that 1% and ignore the impact of furloughing, right? She can't ignore that. And the austerity as well, actually, right? Because when you're in a situation where things are that dire, you really have to tighten your belt so you can survive to fight another day. So again, it depends how you frame these things.
I met them at the budget last year, I met them in the spring, and I have met them today. While the current budget balance is in deficit by £28.8 billion in 26-27 and £4.6 billion in 27-28, it moves into a surplus of £3.9 billion in 28-29, £21.7 billion in 29-30, and £24.6 billion in 2030-31.
Those are all forecasted surpluses. So again, we haven't achieved it yet. And again, according to Rachel Reeves, a forecast is not a prediction of the future.
More than doubling our headroom against the stability rule and meeting that rule a year early too.
Yeah. We're forecast to reach that target a year early. We haven't done it yet.
And our net financial debt is £83.3 in 26-27, 83.6% in 27-28, 83.7% in 28-29, falling to 83.0% in 29-30 and 82.2% in 2030-31. Madam Deputy Speaker, I said we would cut the debt, and we are, with debt down by the end of the forecast. And going forwards, to support our commitment to a single fiscal event and further strengthen our economic stability, I will follow the recommendations of the International Monetary Fund by assessing the fiscal rules just once a year at the budget.
Again, the reason I keep reiterating this point around what she's saying with respect to achieving their targets is that she can't have her cake and eat it, right? She can't, on the one hand, say, a forecast isn't a prediction of the future, take it with a pinch of salt in her pre-budget speech, and then at the time of the budget, congratulate herself for a revised forecast, which is more favorable, right? Whether the forecast is favorable or unfavorable, a forecast, as she has described previously, is just a forecast, right? So it's kind of like, to be fair to her, it is kind of like not a seal of approval, but it just means that it indicates she's going in the right direction, right? Which is good, right? But to argue you've delivered based on a forecast is crazy. In the same way, if I was managing your money and I said to you, I'm forecast to generate a return of 50%, pay me my commission now, what would you say? Like, you'd be like, what are you talking about? Like, piss off. Like, it's just crazy. So for me, it's the language is very, very misleading, if I'm being honest with you. And that is why I'm making a point of like calling this out.
The Conservatives crashed the economy, we are protecting it. The Conservatives lost control of debt, we are getting debt down. The Conservatives let inflation and interest rates go through the roof. But Madam Deputy Speaker, since Labour took office, the Bank of England have cut interest rates 5 times. I've made my choices. Not reckless borrowing, not dangerous cuts, but stability for our economy, security for our public finances, and security for family finances too. Those are the Labour choices. Madam Deputy Speaker, Tory austerity left classrooms crumbling and waiting lists sky high, weakened our productivity and choked our economic growth. And now they propose a further £47 billion of cuts to our public services. Well, that is equivalent to cutting every police officer in our country twice over. And then there is Reform, who promise more than £100 billion of cuts, with no details of where those cuts will come from or who will pay for them.
Okay, these are all true and valid points, but when you've made them already, they kind of lose their impact, right? And what I mean by this, because obviously I've repeated the same point, so, I know that sounds slightly hypocritical, but she's said these things literally word for word, verbatim, in her pre-budget speech. Pretty much the same thing. So it's almost like making the same joke, 2 days in a row and thinking it lands on the second day. It kind of doesn't, right? It might have been a good joke the first time, but then it kind of loses its, sheen and impact, when you hear it repeatedly. So again, it's not really, I'm not sure what to make of that. And then when she talks about the fact that they're proposing cuts, again, it's ignoring and not fully acknowledging their ideology, right? The reason they're proposing cuts is because they don't think what she is doing is sustainable, actually. So it might be affordable now, but it's kind of, and I kind of agree with them somewhat, right? It's kind of like a death by 1,000 cuts from an income tax perspective. It's like, if you keep committing to maintaining standards based on the current tax regime, you're going to constantly squeeze living standards, because, like I say, the cost of maintaining the standard of public sector care and social benefits and social protections, the NHS, will just go up just because the components and the materials and the salaries of everything involved just go up with inflation, right? It just does. So at some point you have to ask yourself, can this continue? And one could say, well, it might be more sustainable if you consider wealth taxes. But apart from the Green Party, nobody in this room is considering a wealth tax. So if you're not considering a wealth tax, then it kind of strengthens Reform's and Conservatives' position, in my opinion, right? And that's the problem Labour have. If they're not going to consider a wealth tax, I think Labour needs to say why not, and how they're going to still fund this in the long term, or introduce a wealth tax, right? I don't think the Conservatives, ironically, or Reform need to justify this or answer this question, because it's not consistent with their ideology. It doesn't make sense for them to even debate that question. But if you're a Labour government, or if you're a Green government, or anything that's socialist leaning, I think you need to have that debate and fully explain your position, actually, around whether or not a wealth tax is a good idea or a bad idea, and also if it's something that can't be done, why it can't be done.
They don't want to hear what the Tories did to schools like mine, but I will tell them. Textbooks rationed, libraries closed, kids herded into porter cabins in the playground, and I came into politics to change that. The money that I allocated at the spending review will fix the crumbling classrooms that the Conservatives left behind and build the schools that they promised but never delivered. And today, thanks to representations from my honourable friends, the members for Wolverhampton North East and Leeds South West and Morley, I will provide £5 million for libraries in secondary schools. Building on...
So again, these are all good things, right? And this is why I kind of believe in the idea of taxation, provided it's progressive and public spending, because it's for things like having good schools, having a good NHS, just the basics in society that creates an environment that facilitates a meritocracy, right? Gives everybody a chance regardless of their background. I struggle to see how that is possible in a society where you are minimizing as an aim public services, right? But again, this is all contingent on it being affordable. And that is the central argument here. I think Reform and the Conservatives are actually making. There's a deeper argument they have, but I think their starting position actually is, and the right position actually is this sustainable? And again, I also have question marks around this with the current tax system.